There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, May 14th, and we will be hearing the presentation, Get Ready, 5 Trends That Will Change Your Community and How to Adapt. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those again in that chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by my home chapter, the Ohio chapter of APA. So thank you, APA Ohio and member Della Rucker for joining us today. And we'll hear a little bit more about Della here in just a moment. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. We are booking through fall right now, and we're just gathering up all the information. And so as the information becomes available and registration is up and live, you can register for our upcoming sessions by heading over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. That's where you're going to find all of our upcoming sessions and also recordings and slide decks of all of our previous sessions. We have been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. So to log your CM credits for attending today's session, head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. So be sure to do that. And like us on Facebook, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post any timely information like time or date changes, when there are new sessions available for you to register for. That's where I post all that kind of good info. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like I said, we record all of our sessions and post them up there. So subscribe to us so that you can get notified when we have sessions available for you to view and share. So again, as a reminder, we'll have a Q&A at the end of today's session. So as you think up questions, just type them in the chat box and we'll be sure to get to those at the end. With that, I am going to turn the controls over to Della Rucker, who will introduce herself and kick us off. So Della, I am going to turn those controls over to you here in just a moment. All right, Della.
All right. So I'm showing my screen. Can you just verify? Whoops, that's too fast. Can you verify that you're seeing that?
I see you on the screen. There we go. Get ready. 5 trends. Yep, it looks perfect.
All right, good. So I am looking right now only at the slides. I did ask Chris to keep my webcam on, mostly because I think it gets really, when you're looking at slides and somebody's going, yeah, me, it gets really boring, and especially for a session this long. So I am going to move that on over to the side, and but I will endeavor to be talking to you as well. So hopefully that makes it a more interesting hour and maybe a little bit. So first of all, I wanted to thank APA Ohio, Chris, and all of these wonderful, wonderful folks and many old-time friends of mine. Not that we're old or anything like that, but to really express appreciation for the opportunity to speak with you all. I have been kind of on a little bit of a weird path over the last few years that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. But I've been a little bit away from planning world, and I'm finding myself stepping back more and more into the planning world. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of come back into the fold maybe a little bit. So for those of you that don't know me, I am an AICP. I'm also a certified economic development planner, a certified economic developer, rather. That's a certification that the American IEDC, of course, now I immediately forgot what all of the letters mean, but the CXD or CECD is the comparable acronym for people who have gone through the industry certification in planning, in economic development, rather. So when you see that after my name, that's what all those letters are for. So I've been an urban planner and also a speaker and writer around urban planning and economic development and related issues for most of the past 20 years. I have worked with communities all over the country. This is actually a picture from a Main Street conference in Washington State a few years ago, where I was privileged to be able to give the keynote. A lot of fun. Really, really enjoyed that work. But over about the last 5 years or so, I started taking a step back from planning, and I started doing more work in the social impact startup space, really for the purpose of trying to get my head around some new ways to do things. So, you know, I'd reached the point where I felt like a lot of the things that I had learned to do weren't necessarily making a difference in the communities that I worked with and the communities that I cared about, at least not making enough of a difference, making as much as I wanted to. So I spent about the last 5 years starting and working with a couple of social impact companies, for-profit companies, a few nonprofits. I kind of had an opportunity to widen my worldview, and I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to do that. And so what we're going to be talking about today is based on a book that I originally wrote in 2013 and updated for this year. The updated version, and if you're interested, you can find this wherever you get books, but I wanted to tell you where this stuff is coming from. The Local Economy Revolution has arrived, is really my attempt to sort of come at the big questions of how the world is changing and how all those changes are impacting our local communities. Here's the basic idea. So, you know, it's always embarrassing when you have a 250-odd page book and you get to sum it down to 3 points, but here we go. So here's the basic idea. If you only have time for the 12-minute version, here you go. The basic idea of this book and really some of the core things that I've been thinking about over the last many years has been these 3 items. So number one, I believe very much that we're living in an era where literally everything is changing. We don't always see that at the local level in our day-to-day lives, but it's still there and it's still a very strong undercurrent. A lot of times the stuff that we did before, whether that's programs or, kind of approaches to how we do the work, they never really worked all that well before. Certainly we've seen, we know that urban renewal created a lot of problems. We know that a lot of the things that our predecessors did kind of made some additional mess. So sometimes something, it really didn't ever work out perfectly well to begin with. Sometimes we have things that seem to work maybe when we started our careers, maybe 20, 30 years ago, maybe public meetings, the way we do public meetings might be one of those. But today it seems to work more poorly than ever. So we're under a very high level of change here. And finally, the third of these kind of mega ideas is that it's not enough to just have new tools. So let's invent a new financial incentive program. Let's invent a new affordable housing program. Let's invent a new kind of paver. We could invent things, but if we don't really understand how the world underneath the things we've invented is different from what we might have assumed, then we're still just doing the same old thing. My mother used to call it putting lipstick on a pig. My mother was from Southern Ohio, so she had lots of colorful sayings when the Spirit moved her. So we need to not only be saying, okay, how can we do stuff differently, but how do the foundations of what we do really need to change to reflect the fact that the world is changing and some of the stuff that we've done isn't working so well anymore. And anytime you're talking about change in kind of foundational beliefs, mindset, the term I use a lot is paradigm. Our paradigms are our basic assumptions. And a lot of times we don't even think too hard about our basic assumptions. The paradigm for folks in your community might be that you have to get in a car to drive everywhere. That's a piece of their paradigm. They just may not even think about there being alternatives. That's an easy one for us as planners to see, but we have our own paradigms as well. And sometimes we can be stuck on our foundational principles, even when maybe some of them don't fit so well anymore. And again, as we're going through this presentation is going to start really, really, really abstract, and it's going to get more and more and more and more concrete as it goes. So if your immediate reaction here is, fine, just tell me how to do it. We'll get as close to that as we can toward the end of the presentation. But again, don't hesitate to pop up questions in that chat. I won't see them until Chris tells me, what to answer. So that's basically where we are. Now, it's interesting when I give this presentation to some audiences, all of this stuff is brand new. Wait, the world isn't exactly the same, and we have to kind of dig that idea out a little bit. You as planners, you know about a lot of the changes that have been going on in the world around us. Certainly climate change in our food systems and our land use, demographic change, aging and diversifying of our populations, and the international, the worldwide trend toward urbanization. So more and more and more people, not only in the U.S., but in many other places, moving into the city. And these are all paradigms and all sort of changes that predate COVID, right? We were talking about climate change and demographics and stuff long before any of us ever knew what a coronavirus was. But in many cases, the pandemic that, thank heavens we're starting to come out of, accelerated a lot of these. So again, you've got a better sense. You as planners have a better sense of what all is changing than a lot of folks do. But those changes that I just showed you, possible exception of climate change, they're not the biggest changes or maybe the most profound or the most long-term changes that I think we're dealing with, and that we're going to be dealing with both at the worldwide and the national, but also at the local level of the communities that we work with and that we care about, whether that's where we work or where we live or whatever. So here's another piece of big framing. And this is really the piece that's going to drive the next 5 big changes that I'm going to talk about. We are in the process of moving from the industrial era into something else. We all know what the industrial era looks like. So the industrial era is mechanized, it's hierarchy, it's top down, it's people, just like machinery, plugging into a system where somebody higher up the food chain has decided that they should plug into, and then making something bigger, making something more complicated, making something more powerful than any of those individuals would be able to make on their own. So if you think about a factory, and I grew up in a manufacturing environment, everybody I knew, not only my family, but everybody I knew worked in a factory. And when you work in a factory, in a traditional industrial era factory, you go in, you clock in, you do the work that's assigned to you, however big or small that task might be, and then you clock out. So your value is determined by the amount of time you put in, and then you go home. When you think about it that way, you can see two things. Number one, you don't have to work in a factory like that picture in order to kind of be living by those same basic ideals. And in fact, Seth Godin, who is a business and marketing guru that some of you might have read, he is the most concise writer of prose I've ever seen. It's amazing what he can say in very few words. He said yesterday, or the day before, are we going to pay people by the value they produce or by the hours that they put in? Paying by the hours you put in is industrial era. Paying by the value they produce is maybe this future era. Now, I put up a picture of an atom here. That future era that we're moving into has had a lot of different names. I don't think we've settled on a name yet. The World Economic Forum calls it the fourth industrial revolution, which is very intelligent. It's a little geeky because you have to understand what an industrial revolution is, and it doesn't necessarily involve machines, and what about agriculture, and blah, blah, blah. So that gets a little, I'm not so keen on that one. Some people have been calling it the network economy, which to me makes a lot of sense, but sometimes it sounds a little bit like we're just trading business cards at a Rotary luncheon, right? Sometimes we think that's network. And that's just scratching the surface of what a network can really mean. I actually did a fascinating, it's on YouTube, it's on my channel on YouTube, it's free. But I did a fascinating conversation with 3 really incredible grassroots change makers the other day, a couple weeks ago. And we talked for an hour about what is a network and how do networks work today. So I really love the idea of it, of thinking about it as a network world, but I don't think we're ready for that terminology yet. Instead, what I've been calling it is a fusion era. I think we're moving into a fusion era. And that can get confusing because it's like, well, wait, but is that like fusion food? And at first I went, no. And then I went, well, yes. If you're fusing molecules, you're taking 2 molecules and you're putting them together. And you're putting them together in a way that forms a new thing. If you're doing fusion cuisine, you're taking ingredients and methods and dishes from one part of the world and ingredients and methods and dishes from another part of the world, and you're putting them together to create something that's completely new. So I think that's a really powerful metaphor for thinking about how our world is changing, is that we're going from this kind of very, take this piece and stick it onto that piece and add this piece to it and then paint it sort of approach to creating something new. And if you picture a Model T coming off of an assembly line in an old, piece of movie that you've seen, we're moving from that to a world where we're going to be creating value by taking things that are different and really putting them together in a brand new way. So I think it's pretty exciting. It's also really hard to get your head around. So if that's still feeling like, what? I get it. Don't worry about it. Hopefully the rest of this will make it a little more clear. So let's not do that. Let's do this. What's this fusion era look like? Well, at this point, we're early, obviously. It's still really super fuzzy. If you think about the industrial era, it was like decades upon decades that was unfolding before people really got to the point of being able to say, okay, this is what this new era is about. I don't know that we're there yet, but we are seeing 5 characteristics. And this is showing up if you look at what the World Economic Forum is doing, what futurists are doing, what business strategists are doing. A lot of this is coming from that work. In the industrial era, we really placed a high value on predictability. In fact, we assumed predictability so much that we we went very lean on everything. And we cut, whether it's businesses or it's government agencies, we cut a lot of things to the bone. And cutting things to the bone is assuming that everything is going to stay exactly the same as it is now, or it's going to change in a very predictable manner. Like when we do we used to do demographic extrapolations for plans that literally you just took a percentage. You said, well, the average over the last 20 years was 2.3%, and you just, projected a straight line. We do not live in a world of predictability anywhere near what we got used to in the industrial era. And instead, the terminology that is being used to describe the current situation is VUCA. So maybe some of you have heard that term, especially if you've got particularly egg-headed business strategy council people or something. VUCA is this ridiculous, incredible combination of words. Volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. Volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. And you can find business and futurists and, just thinkers who are talking about what it means to live in a world that is VUCA instead of being a world that is predictable or stable. And that's a very profound difference. We mentioned climate change before. Obviously, climate change is volatile. It's uncertain. It can be very chaotic because there's no, ipso facto, there's no cause and effect often, not clearly. And it's ambiguous. Sometimes there's a benefit for one community and a very serious liability for another. That's the characteristic of a VUCA world. So put that one in your head. And again, think of that as a framework that as you look at things that are going on in your community or in the world, that looks like a VUCA situation. That makes sense. That's reflective of a VUCA context. So here's another one. When I was a little kid, and I'm 52, so yeah, I'm not that old-ish. When I was a kid growing up, we got our news not from a thing like this, but we got our news from one of 3 or 4 sources, right? We got it from one of the serious, well-dressed Centaurian men on the nightly news. We got it from 1 or 2 major newspapers and maybe a radio show once in a while. And because it was coming from these sources, we trusted it. We believed it. They told us that was what was going on, and we said, oh, okay, that must be what's going on. And if you go back to the 50s and 60s, We treated government. When a government told you that this is what we're going to do, we're going to knock down these buildings to put that in, we said, okay, you must know what's best. We don't live that way anymore. Not only do we get our information from 1,000 sources, some of which may be very reliable, some of which may be horrid, and we may not know unless we're, putting it together. But we also don't trust what we're hearing or seeing, at least not those of us who are, sometimes people are putting trust where they shouldn't be putting trust, right? I think that's a trying to hang on to, somebody's got to be the Tom Brokaw and the Peter Jennings of my life. And so I will make that people whose political beliefs agree with me. And that is very problematic in this moment, but that's a last gasp of that system. The bigger thing that I would encourage you to be thinking about is that authority, trustworthiness, reliability, that's not a given. That's not something that people will give you, will give your government or your organization. It's not something that they will give media sources unless it's been earned. And it's incredibly easy to destroy that. Much easier to break that trust than it is to build it. So, wrong button. We used to live in a world of hierarchy. And many of you very much, because you're in an organization, a government that was created during the industrial era, you still live in a world of hierarchy. Outside of where you are, power, influence, the ability to make something happen is more and more and more and more dependent on networks. So a person who runs a small business, their ability to grow that business, scale that business, become a big employer, become the next Google or whatever example you want to use, depends enormously, not on how much coal they can get or how many trucks they can buy, but it depends on their network. And so that's a move from physical resources to kind of social resources that I don't think we really, and that's why I shy away from calling this a network era, because I don't think we really have our heads around the real power of a network in this new social and economic system, this era that we're moving into. This is one that's really fascinating to me. If you look at what's happening in science, in the startup world, in medicine, what you're going to see is that the most groundbreaking work is happening in the spaces between the traditional disciplines. So the last several Nobel Prizes in most of the sciences have gone to people who came to it'll be in a particular category like chemistry or economics or whatever, but it's people who came to that work from a different discipline. The Santa Fe Institute is doing some of the most fascinating work scientifically of anybody out there, and it's because they have intentionally built these kinds of cross-discipline collaboration. And finally, and the network and the fusion, the space between questions kind of got to this. If we have a world where your value is based on what you can create, your value is not based on your labor. Your value is based on what you can problem solve, what you can create, how well you navigate those networks, how well you navigate those spaces between where the opportunity to build something new really lies. Then who has access? Who is valuable? starts to change very dramatically. Now, we're not here yet because we're still at a point where people who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds are still fighting an enormous uphill battle to get into what we call the knowledge economy or the creative economy. But it also means that if you are not living in the place where all the hot stuff is happening, you may remember, all of this talk that we had in the 2000s, Edward Glaser writing a book about collision and how important collision was. Those collisions, first of all, collision doesn't actually work all that well. We can talk about that if you want to. But the people who can be part of those collisions, or can be part of that creating something new, are now coming from places that you may have never imagined them coming from before. These two gentlemen are in Tanzania, and I believe this was in 2017. They're at a hackathon. They're in one of the most impoverished countries in the world, but because they have internet access and they have the support of a collection of tech companies, they're having the opportunity to create legitimately new solutions. And because they're not coming out of the traditional pipeline, chances are they're going to find something really new, or they have a potential to find something really new. So that's our characteristics of this new world, as it's unfolding all around us and just going faster and faster now as we're coming out of the coronavirus pandemic. So what does that mean? It means that, and again, this is overall, these points apply whether you're in government or business or nonprofit or school or wherever. These are kind of fundamental. And this is what I meant when I talked about the foundation needing to be rebuilt. We're going to have to be flexible in our mindset about how we do things. We have to know what we're trying to achieve, but the best way to do that may change all the time. You can think about, in a physical context, if I'm trying to get from here to there, but power line falls down, or hurricane wipes out a piece of the road, or a tornado goes through. So, those are climate change related impacts. I have to change my route. That's going to be the case fundamentally for a lot of things that we have to deal with. Second issue is that command and control increasingly doesn't work. And in fact, organizations that are, and this is from the federal government down, that are trying to rely on command and control are having to put more and more and more and more effort and force around that. We can see that with the efforts to control who's able to vote. That's just taking more and more and more effort to hold that back. In the future, and increasingly, we're seeing this now, the organizations that are able to make the biggest impact are the ones that are being humble, that are saying, there's things that we just don't know, and transparent. And I think that's a huge challenge for people who work in government, because that's not the system very often that our foundations are built upon right now. Making impact, this is a little more important for business, but making impact is more and more dependent on networks. So part of, if you're involved in economic development, part of your responsibility might shift, maybe shifting from find a building, sell a building, etc., to building networks and connecting your existing businesses into the broader networks that they need to thrive. There was a really interesting piece that just came out about, it was run on CNBC. It was prepared by a Harvard lecturer about the need for generalists and the need for people to not only have technical expertise, but to be able to connect across those spaces between, like we talked about before. And finally, our most important raw materials anymore are not, they are this. Our most important raw materials anymore are not coal, are not rock. Those things will continue to have some importance. But the real opportunities for economic growth, social growth, even physical growth, come from this stuff, come from the human ability to create and problem solve. And so I think that part of our responsibility in the local government, regional government, state government, etc., part of our responsibility is going to shift from trying to build the things in which people happen to helping people unlock this stuff. And that's a very profound, that's like taking out a huge chunk of the foundation and putting in something new. All right, this is the last section. What does all this have to do with my job in my city, where I am, or my township, my county, whatever? That's all big stuff. I gotta run the zoning code. I gotta, get the permits done. I gotta make the city council happy. I gotta deal with my planning commission. This doesn't have anything to do with me. But it does. So I'm going to give you a few more kind of pieces that are ways that you can start actually putting this stuff into action. And then I'm going to wrap up with a little snapshot of some of the challenges that we're going to face if we don't. We love in planning and in economic development and in government in general, businesses like to do this too, to do a thing and say that by doing this thing, we're going to make something great happen. One of the big challenges of the addressing food deserts has been that, we can put an enormous amount of effort into putting a grocery or a bodega or food trucks or whatever into a neighborhood. But if people don't change their behavior because of that thing being there, then we may not actually be having the impacts on health, on wellness, on all of the things that we said we were putting that in there to do. And so, again, because things are volatile, unpredictable, chaotic, ambiguous, we have to make certain that if we're putting in a thing, that we don't just say, oh, we built a grocery store and everything's going to be great now. It's not that easy. If we are going to actually move a needle, we may very well have to sort of reverse engineer the behavior. So there's been lots of situations where a grocery store goes in and it's offering lots of fresh foods, but because of the generational poverty that has affected that community, people may not know how to cook that stuff anymore. And so there's a need for education. People might learn how to cook that stuff, but it doesn't appeal to their palate that have gotten used to fats and sugars and salts and the like. So how do you address that? Is that a marketing campaign? Is that sort of an influencer campaign? How do you change that? So it's not all physical solutions. And I think that's a really hard thing for planners to get around. I think, frankly, if we could build the solutions, we'd have solved it already. If the solution were a physical thing, chances are we would have solved it already. Or at least solved it in some places to some extent. We'd at least have some good indicators. But we've got a lot of really thorny problems that haven't necessarily been solved by building a physical thing. And economic developers, I diss them as well. Don't feel like I'm picking on planners. I'm an equal opportunity picker-oner, I hope. Economic developers, they love the big project, the big ribbon cutting. this new business is going to transform our economy. Well, is it really? We have to understand what the system is, not just do a thing and think that's going to be a magic lever. That's going to make it happen. I'm a big advocate, and I get in trouble with economic developers sometimes, my peers on that side of the equation, because there's a very fundamental truth that we very often overlook. When we grow something local, whether it's a business or it's, a flower, a plant that's native to our area, chances are that can be more resilient, especially if we don't have, invasive species. Again, you can use that as a metaphor, or you can use it in reality. We can make it so that if we don't interfere with their ability to thrive, we end up with something much more resilient. We end up with a much stronger economy. If you take a look at businesses, the ones that have stayed in communities for the longest are almost never the ones that were transplanted there by an economic developer. Instead, where a business is able to have the most economic impact, the most community, cultural, social impact, it's where they took root as a small business and grew. And you can find that example in your community. A lot of times we've lost some of those over the last many years. And so perhaps it's time to plant a new crop of bulbs. And again, I think that has implications for how we design buildings, how we prioritize investment, even down to what we do with streets. The biggest thing that I criticize economic developers and urban planners about, certainly one of the biggest things, is about doing public engagement that is lip service. And I don't push and yell and advocate for inclusion, top to bottom, through the whole process. I don't advocate for that because it's a nice thing to do and it's being good and it's being, all of that kind of thing. All of which I believe. I think it's a moral imperative to include people. But we also know that we will find better answers, better impact. All those new solutions that I said we needed, we need people who are coming from outside of our own paradigm, our own box, our own blinders. We need the people who are hearing and seeing and experiencing something else. And that's a very, very, very practical reason to do more inclusive engagement. And that doesn't, to me, just mean sending out the notice to more people, doing it in more languages, etc., although those are good things to do. But it also means including. It means enabling, equipping those people to be part of the process and not just giving feedback on something that's already mostly completed. We need not only their yay or their nay, but we need their eyes and we need their ears and we need their insights and we need their ability to see what we maybe can't see. This aligns with that. Some of you may know I did a book years ago that was called Crowdsourcing Wisdom. And the point of crowdsourcing wisdom is exactly what I just said. Drawing in a wider sense of what's possible. And getting more minds at it. And we have very good evidence in business and organizational theory that that more diverse groups are very consistently more likely to find novel, effective solutions. That's been really well documented. along the same lines, we really have to enable everyone in our community to be agents of change. And that means being entrepreneurial. Not everybody who's entrepreneurial is going to start a business. But being entrepreneurial in this case means taking the initiative to do it, to make it happen. And finally, I think this is the final one. I moved these around a little bit. I talked about this before with levers. I wanted to come back to this point in a different way here. We love magic pills, man. And it's not just us planners. It's everybody who's associated with local government and with a lot of businesses too. If you tell me that we can build that thing or give a grant for that thing or put an economic development incentive on that thing, and it's going to just do everything. It's going to solve all the problems. It's going to be great. We want that. We so want that. And I apologize for cussing. But man, oh man, we want that. We want that. And yet, if we look back honestly at our history, in our community, in our profession, and we go back 100 years, our magic pill, I don't care if you're talking about Pruitt-Igoe, or you're talking about one of the World Fairs, or you're talking about a neighborhood project. Our magic pills, they have a lousy track record of actually doing the thing that we wanted them to do. Again, just doing that's not enough. We really have to think about the humans in that context. And what does human psychology, what does human sociology tell us also needs to happen to make the change in people that we built that thing for to begin with. This is actually the last one. Part of what I did in the 5 years when I stepped out of planning was to start a business and I have a co-founder, and with my co-founder, I started a business in an area in an area of work that I had very little experience in. I'm not a business person. I'm a planner. I'm an economic developer. I've been a consultant in those spaces for, by that point, 20 plus years. And in doing that business, I had to take everything that I had learned, everything I had assumed, even down to very basic things like how you talk to a client. And I had to throw all that stuff out. And I spent a year just going through everything that I did, having to rethink it, having to evaluate it and take it apart. And okay, this was the assumption that I made. Does this assumption still fit in this context? Do I need to do this differently? And doing it differently, not only is that an extremely difficult process and it's exhausting, but doing it differently means taking a risk. It means trying to do something in a way that I haven't done before. And maybe doing that in front of people that I don't want to look bad in front of. And so this process of rethinking how we do this work, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's scary. It's difficult. And we have to bring a certain level of bravery to this work because we have to. There was a great story that went with this, and I think I'm going to skip it for now. The short version is that I alluded to this before. We can't build our way out of this. Now, infrastructure improvements, dealing with our legacy of underfunded and deteriorating infrastructure, humongously important. I don't deny that one iota. I have bridges that I refuse to drive over in my hometown because I know a little too much. And I suspect a lot of you would say the same thing. But solving the physical problems aren't necessarily going to get us all of the impacts that we as planners, and if we look at our ethics, and we look at what we said we were in this to do, we're not necessarily going to make all the impact through physical building and rebuilding. We have to start thinking about the people and the organizations, the communities of people in a new way. And so what do we do with that? And this is the last piece of this. We need to get clear on our mission. Remember, I said before that the kind of the precondition or the fundamental, the steady state of the VUCA environment is that we may have to change how we do things as we go through. But we have to know where we're going, or those changes as we're going through are going to take us someplace very different. So we have to sort of have our North Star. And a lot of communities that I've worked with over the past 20 odd years, they'll have a mission statement or a vision statement. Very few of them really embed that deeply into the culture and the work and the kind of the driving force of their government or their community. Opening the doors as widely as possible. Bringing in participation from the people who haven't participated before. And I know how hard it is to get folks to participate. Believe me, I've been fighting that for 20 years. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to keep doing it. And maybe if they're not responding to our call, our invitation, maybe one of two things is going on. Number one, we're not talking their language. Actually, three. We're not talking their language. We're not expressing it in a way that really communicates to their concerns and their issues and what they need to bring to the table. Number two, they may not trust us. Just because I, as a new planner in a community, say, oh, we want your involvement, we want your participation, we really care what you think. If the last 30 or 40 years of planning has shown that to be false, you can't blame them. And there was a third one that I can't think of at the moment, but those were the important ones. And I think it's increasingly crucial, and planners are actually better at this last one than many people, but we have to be really conscious about it. We put up a lot of false artificial silo walls. We say, oh, I don't do economics. We just care about the physical design. Somebody else has to worry about whether it's a good use economically. And that may be where your job description begins and ends. But you're still going to be impacted by the other thing. So figuring out how to avoid that kind of siloed mentality, I think, is increasingly, crucially important. We talked about cross-group problem solving. There's a great guy in the Northeast named Saul Kaplan who has a business incubator, and his line over and over again is try more stuff. Just try stuff. Now, what we don't want to do is create another giant legacy program that will last forever if we're not sure that that's going to be pointed in the right direction. So we have to be agile. We have to be anticipating volatility. We do it small. We do it tested. City of Salt Lake. And this actually came out of the Economic Development Department. But they did a beautiful pilot with a small group of homeless people in Salt Lake City, getting them into work. Now, it was a pilot. It was very small. I hope that they will build on it. I don't know if they will. And we do an awful lot of pilots that don't go anywhere. But if the pilot shows potential, we have to be ready to go with it. And finally, I don't think it's surprising to anybody here that planners are kind of lousy at telling their own story. And we try. We've had initiatives. We plan. And we don't really tell the story of our community very well. Why is that development important? Why does that need to be rebuilt? Why do we want people to participate? How is this different from what we did in the past? And so building that understanding over time, it's more than a soundbite. It's more than a press release. Figuring out how to help people understand what the city's really doing, what the government is really doing, and not just cities, of course. That's really, really, really crucial. Last two things. Everybody says, I don't have time, I don't have money. We're cut to the bone, we don't have the flexibility. Understood. I understand. We face some challenges. And the biggest one, I think, for planners is cynicism. Our cynicism and the cynicism of the people in the communities who give up on us. And then we end up in a dysfunctional relationship, right? The downside being that we can't actually separate from each other. But if we could figure out how to open up, to move into this new era, to be more honest and transparent, to be more inclusive, it creates new possibilities. And I think those possibilities can be absolutely mind-blowing. The moral of the story, though, is that all of those changes that we talked about, all of that big stuff at the beginning, it's coming. And you're not going to hold it back. When the tide comes in, it doesn't really care whether you wanted another half an hour on the beach. It doesn't really care if, it's your last day there and we don't want to go yet. The tide doesn't care. It comes in anyway. And that's where we are with these changes and these macro issues that are transforming the communities that we work in and that we care about. It's going to happen. So the question becomes, in the face of that, how do we change? And how do we help our communities really ride those waves? So thanks. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen. I have a really unusual first name, and there's not a lot. I don't think there's another Della AICP out there in the universe, probably. So if you want to find me and find, the books, the videos, the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I've written a god-awful amount of stuff, most of which is available for free on the internet. Somewhere or the other, the books are, books. You know where to find me. And Madam Chris.
Thank you.
I done talked all the talking I can talk.
Okay.
Have we got any questions, or have I just completely bewildered everybody?
I think, if you do have questions, type them. I know I have questions. Type them into that chat box. I sort of feel like we just got ourselves out of a therapy appointment with you, Della. Like Della, the life coach, I guess, just ripping the Band-Aid off for us. It is what it is. This is how it's going to be. Get on board or some ship, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
a lot of, right? You touched on a lot of things, and I personally would like to just unpackage a couple of them. And again, folks, type your questions in if you have them, and I'll stop rambling, and you can get your questions going. So one of the things that you mentioned kind of over and over again is this concept of crowdsourcing and bringing in new people, bringing in the appropriate people to lend that new perspective. How do we do that? How do we find them? How do we know what we need, where to find them?
That's a great question. That's absolutely a great question. So the first thing that I'll say is that when I go into it, when I have gone into a community, and I don't do much consulting because I have some businesses that I'm running and I'm talking and writing and stuff. But when I do go into a community and I ask who's not showing up, who's not participating, I can get a list. Like, they'll tell me right away, we can't get these people and we can't get these people and we can't, and and there's a immigrant population over there that we've never had participate in anything. I mean, I have found that nobody knows a community better than the urban planner, which is awesome. I mean, it puts you, if I talk to a Main Street downtown revitalization program, I'll get maybe a couple of possible populations. The planners will have 30. If I talk to the economic developers, maybe they can think of 5. The planners have 30. I mean, so nobody knows this stuff better than the planners in terms of who's out there. How you get them to participate is a whole nother question. There's some really simple ways. If you're dealing with people who speak another language as their home language, having interpreters, having materials in their language, those are, relatively low-hanging fruit. If you're dealing with people who are young families, people who have children, single parents, etc., having good quality childcare at the event is essential. But the biggest thing is to build the relationship. And a lot of people who are working in public engagement and really working very seriously at it will say build the relationship before you need it. And I think that's incredibly crucial. It's not always something we can do, right? Because sometimes you're just stuck. One way that I have found to help to bridge that gap is that most sub-communities, whether it's an African American neighborhood or an immigrant population or young mothers or whoever, that there's sort of organizations and there's leaders of organizations that you can get to and you can talk to. I've spent a lot of time with pastors of African American and African diaspora congregations. Those folks, number one, are typically more used to interfacing with the world outside of their community. Number two, chances are they'll have more of an understanding of how what you're trying to do at the city level or I keep saying city, I mean government level or agency level, how that fits with what their community needs. So finding those people who can be sort of the liaisons or the bridge builders, those are if you think about the network diagram that I showed before, those are the people who have very extensive networks in those communities. And if you can reach into that node, that person who has a node, and chances are, because planners are coming from a good place, you're not trying to sell them snake oil. You're trying to help them and help the community. Chances are, you'll be able to make that connection. I have always found that to be much more crucial. And in fact, a lot of communities that I've worked with, that African American pastor, that's been the most powerful relationship that I could build in that community. So does that answer that question, Chris?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool.
Next up, so we are at a phenomenal nexus right now. The world shut down last year. It's just now starting to open back up again. We're starting to really get an understanding of what lies ahead for us in terms of recovery, and just our tasks ahead are in building resiliency and trying to get back to some kind of stability is really daunting. Is now the time to step back and look at these macro issues and say, where's the trash can? We're going to throw everything that we knew how to do. We're going to throw it in the trash can, and we need to start all over again because it has never worked. It is not working now. It's not going to work for us in the future. We're at this nexus. Now's the time to do it. Or is that just asking for you to is that a terrible idea? When is the right time?
What you just described sounds like you're going to throw everything in the trash, and then you're going to sit in the corner and do this.
Well, that's kind of what I'm envisioning. It's like, well, okay, so now we did that, and now, whoops, maybe we shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
So when is the time to really look at these overarching issues and taking a step back? It is now the time to do it, because this moment in time, hopefully, won't happen again in our lifetime.
Yeah.
Hopefully. This is it. So
yeah.
Now the time to do it.
I think so. There's two parts to that. There's at least two parts to that question. I'll probably think of another one as I go through here. I never get the number right at the beginning. Number one is, I don't think you have a choice. Because if you look at those issues that I laid out, VUCA, spaces between, networks, etc., what the pandemic really did is accelerate a lot of this. So we were already talking about VUCA before the pandemic happened, and the pandemic just made everything more VUCA, right? Networks were hugely important and becoming increasingly important before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, when you can't go out and build new networks, the power of your existing network becomes all the more important. So unfortunately, the good news, bad news scenario, I guess. The bad news is, sorry, I think it's not a question of should we or shouldn't we. It's basically, yeah, you're going to have to. Because, again, that tide is coming in, and it ain't going to wait until you feel like it and you feel like you can, pull the appropriate mega committee together or whatever. The good news side of it is that all of this stuff is on a continuum. So the example that you laid out is an either or. We either do everything all at once right now and we throw all the old stuff in the trash, or we do absolutely nothing and we go, la, 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 la. I don't pretend, nothing's changed. We do it exactly the way we always have. And in reality, neither of those is healthy, not healthy for you as humans, certainly not healthy for your communities, and neither of those has to be the reality. So it's going to be an iterative process, right? So being aware that these things these sort of master trends are developing, that sounds really bad that way. But being aware that these trends are developing means that we got to be thinking about them as we're going through this process. And maybe that doesn't mean that we do everything perfectly the first time. We can't yank all the stones out of the foundation because the building will fall down. But maybe we can take out one and we can change how that program is being done as we're getting ready to relaunch it into the post-pandemic world. So I'm speaking kind of metaphorically. Every situation is going to be different, which I feel like is something you say if you're a hedge fund manager. But it's going to be a situation of kind of trying to find the right way forward, knowing that all of this kind of macro change is underway. Does that make sense?
So
okay.
Let's say we as planners, we take a step back, right? We sort of have this moment where we dig down deep. We look at the scenarios in front of us as planners, and we say, you know what, the tide really is coming in, and we need to move now. We need to make changes, right? How do we approach, convince the decision makers, the influencers? How do we reach them and say, this is important. This is important right now, and we need to make some drastic changes. How do we convince them?
So part of the reason why I coach a lot of this stuff, or couch, we'll go couching. I couch a lot of this in very big terms, and I'll use examples that are from all over the place, is that you may need to give them examples that are relevant to them. So VUCA is an easy one. So where's the situation in your community where you're either at higher risk than maybe you thought previously, or you've always been at high risk? You know, what's the consequences if this higher level of Nassim Taleb is an author who wrote the book Anti-Fragile, which it's definitely worth a read. He's also the one who coined the term the black swan event. And the thinking behind the VUCA, terminology is that those black swan events are more likely now than ever before. So you can find a ton of corroborating information on this from the business world. And I don't tell planners that they should act like business people by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think that's appropriate in the least. But if you can pull some of that thinking from the Harvard Business Review and Forbes and, whatever, Wall Street Journal or whatever, and that's pretty easy, relatively easy Google searching, that may be more persuasive. Or having, somebody, maybe a business leader in your community who is a, kind of a strategic forward thinker, talking to them about, how they're seeing the world changing. Because I can assure you that most people who are in the C-suite of businesses that have any kind of national or international reach, they're talking about this stuff now. And so it may be that they need, that your electeds, appointeds, et cetera, need to be hearing this from people other than you. There's an example in Ohio of a city called Dublin that before I don't think this was while we knew what VUCA was. But they wanted to make some very profound changes in how they did things. And it's an affluent community. I know, Chris, you know Dublin well. Rather than just have the city manager and the economic development director and the planning director and et cetera trying to teach the community, the electeds, the appointed, the active citizens about the changes that they saw affecting their community, they brought in people who were outsiders, who were insiders, who were residents and were CEOs, or who were professors. They brought in people to kind of point to the issues that they wanted to address. So I think that may be a tactical way to get over some of that resistance. And yeah, you're still probably going to have some people who are going la 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 la. But if you can start changing some minds, that's going to start to tip the equation.
So we are, yes. We, I would say for the most part, are creatures of habit, and we are most comfortable in things that are predictable. Do you feel that people are trying to force us back to our old normal?
Oh, yeah.
Or do you feel that people are, at least maybe in our profession or even just the general public, are like, you know what, we understand there are just some things that are never going to be the same again. We have understood the value. Some people just are more efficient working from home. Businesses don't need to have as much office space right now. We understand this moving forward, that this is just the wave of the future. Or do you feel the majority of people are like, no, we're all headed back to the office, back, declutter your desk, dust it off, get back in there, back to normal? What do you think? Or do you think it's a mixture of both?
I think it's definitely a mixture, and it's a mixture that's going to be very different in the next week than it is going to be a year from now. And it's going to be a very different mixture in a week than it's going to be in 5 years from now. And so, yes, I think in the short term, we are creatures of habit. We are going to say, oh, but I just want it to be all the way back. It was. I mean, I this morning bought tickets to a music festival. First one I've been to in, since well before the pandemic. And I was giddy because, oh my God, this is a return to something that I loved before. And so, yeah, I do think that we're all going to have some pressure, and organizations, especially those who are either not understanding or afraid of, this writing on the wall, may try to push back really hard. Again, and this is my privilege, right? I can do this. From my perspective, I don't worry too much about that pushback because I think it's a short-term thing. Because again, the tide is changing, and the tide doesn't care whether, you want to have all of your, minions around you sitting at desks like good little chickadees. Now, in the short term, there has been some study lately about how, projecting that a lot of people aren't going to want to go back to the traditional office. I just wrote about that on the Substack that I do. We don't know. Chances are it's going to look very, very different. Chances are a lot of people aren't going to want to come back, and people who try to push back the tide are probably going to get knocked over by the tide. So that doesn't solve the short-term problem of people being stubborn and people not wanting to change, but it does pretty clearly indicate, I think, that a lot of these things are going to change whether we like it or not, whether we personally like it or not.
Thank you.
And then she goes,
we have another question. Right?
Sure.
How and should we as planners and economic developers encourage high-risk populations to adapt to changes in the economy?
That's a great question. And I'm super grateful to whoever asked that, both because I really think it's so incredibly important to talk about at-risk communities, and because he said, whoever that was said planners and economic developers. So, I feel whole again. I don't actually work on most of that day to day, but, so be it. And at-risk communities have taken just some unbelievable hits. There is an article in the latest issue of Governing that shows how even neighborhoods that were really stable up to like 20 years ago, predominantly Black neighborhoods that were, pretty solid middle class, have just been decimated over the last 20 years. And if you haven't read it, I'd recommend you go find that in Governing, which is now all digital. Incredible article, incredible story. Yeah, they have taken enormous hits. I'm personally pretty invested in a couple of approaches. One is entrepreneurship, but it has to be entrepreneurship that's very well supported by the community. And by the community, I mean everything from, financial to marketing to everything else. Far too often, we have given lip service to entrepreneurship in disadvantaged communities, and they have paid for our lip service in blood. We've done a lot of things wrong in supporting entrepreneurship in at-risk communities. I think so to me, entrepreneurship and personal agency are kind of, two peas in a pod. They're kind of maybe two sides of the same coin is a better metaphor. If people are able to kind of take control, have a voice, have a meaningful voice in the future of their community, and they feel like they believe and have evidence that they are being heard and not just given lip service, then that's going to enable these communities collectively to identify more clearly what they need. Because I guarantee you that as a white planner, even in the town where I live, as a white planner coming in from a position of relative privilege, and I can say, oh yeah, my dad was unemployed for years and I know what it's like to be poor and blah, blah, blah. I don't know what it's like to live in their situation. But if the people who are living there can really be empowered to find their own voice and to identify for themselves what they need, that's where real effective change starts, and that's where the ability to find these new solutions starts. So I would say that's the most important thing, is to the greatest extent possible, support those communities. And I mean support, like money, to build the agency and the capacity to really understand what they need. And they're going to need planners to help them understand what the alternatives are, but they have to be the decision-making force. Okay?
Thank you. This was heavy and deep. I think we're going to wrap up. I think we're good.
Yes, everybody needs to go outside and take a walk. Seriously. I know. I live with this stuff. I live with this stuff all the time anymore. So I don't see it as heavy. I really do see it as a moment of incredible opportunity. I mean, we've in our lifetimes, we got all excited 10 years ago when we had the Livable Communities grants. Holy Moses, that was awesome. We're at a point now where what we're capable, what the possibilities are just unbelievable. But we can't come at them like this, because we're only going to see what we're used to seeing. So when you take that walk, look around a little more broadly. You might find something really cool.
Thank you, Della. This was great. As always, thank you for joining us and lending your perspective. As a reminder, this session has been recorded. We'll post it up onto our YouTube channel. And make sure that you log those CM credits. 1.5 credits are available for you. If you have any other questions, contact Della, and I'm sure she'd be happy to ramble on and answer more questions and blow your mind.
or say I'm sorry for making the world heavy. Again, last thing I'll say, I really don't think it is. And anything we do, I mean, we can't necessarily make everything perfect, but there's an enormous amount that we can do. So maybe instead of feeling like, oh my God, here's the opportunity. I usually end my broadcasts, my videos and the like with this phrase, which is go get them, because you can.
Thanks, Stella. Everyone have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye.